Welcome to the Stonebridge Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Goodman. I'm publisher of Stonebridge Press, and lurking in Brooklyn today is Michael Palmer. If you don't know, Stonebridge Press is a book publisher in the Bay Area. We publish books mostly about Japan because that's where I lived, and I got my start in publishing way back in the 1970s. And on today's podcast, we're talking about books, and we're talking about people who write those books. And today we're especially talking to one of those people, Stephen Mansfield. And if you read the Japan Times, I'm sure you've seen his many book reviews, many of them on art and culture, gardens. He is a photojournalist whose works appeared in over 70 publications worldwide. And his latest book, which is coming out this fall, will be The Modern Japanese Garden, with a foreword by Pico Iyer. And it's going to be published in the United States by Timber Press, which is part of the Hachette Group, and in the UK, it'll be published by the prestigious publisher Thames and Hudson. So, hello, Stephen. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Well, it's great to have you, and we will get to your latest book, but you are a very accomplished author. You've written, I don't know how many books you'll have to tell me, but why don't you talk a little bit about your own writing, in particular books you've written about Japan?
Well, maybe I can go back to the sort of genesis of my involvement with writing and photography. I guess I started in the 1980s doing street photography in London, where I was working, and was lucky enough to have a couple of exhibitions. I think in those days, it was much easier to approach publications. I mean, in my case, I just walked into a magazine called The Middle East and asked if I could meet the editor. There were no barriers. I chatted with the editor, and I eventually ended up doing a lot of work for them. Also ended up working in the Middle East, covering the civil war in Lebanon in the mid-80s as a war photographer. Before coming to Japan, there was a delay in my visa processing, so I had a lot of time to do photography and travel. I didn't really start writing until I got to Japan. My first books, the first books that came out, were books concerned with Southeast Asian topics. My first book, Laos, A Portrait, I think it came out in 1997, was the beginning of my sort of 20 books later. At that time, a lot of journalists were going to Vietnam. That was the big story, or Cambodia. So I decided to go to Laos, and I visited many times and ended up producing 4 books on that country.
And those were books for travelers?
No, one of them, Laos, A Portrait, was a sort of what you call a coffee table book, I guess. Lots of photos, history background, introduction. Another one I did for Oxford University Press was called Lao Tribe Traditions, which was amateur anthropology, I guess, or ethnography. And I did a children's book and various things. And then it sort of spun from there into covering various aspects of Southeast Asia, including some guidebooks. I did a guidebook to the Philippines and one to Yunnan province. Quite a lot of work for Dorling, Kindersley. Mm-hmm. And then it sort of struck me one day that I'm living in Japan. I'm sitting on, this treasure trove of potential material. Let's start writing about Japan.
And what was your first Japan book?
Let me think. I think my first one was Japanese Stone Gardens.
Oh, so you're writing about gardens at the very beginning.
Yeah, it's called Japanese Stone Gardens, Origins, Meaning and Form. And then I did another book on gardens called Japan's Master Gardens, Lessons in Space and Environment. Got involved with some guidebook writing as well on Japan, and things kind of evolved from that.
Were those first books, who was the publisher? Were those Tuttle?
Those first 2 were Tuttle, that's right, yeah.
So you were writing about gardens from very early on, but I take it you're not a landscape designer by trade. This was a kind of an artistic or personal interest of yours?
It was, yeah. I mean, I'm English, so I grew up with gardens. I've visited over 500 gardens in Japan, and started writing articles about them. Well, I think that's a model for my books, that a lot of my books have come from articles I've written on a certain subject. It's like a snowdrift. You it builds up, and then you see that you have a body of work there that could be transformed into a book.
So you get an accretion of information either on paper or in your mind, and then you say, I'm going to go, and then I guess becomes more of a rigorous process of discovery. And
that's right. You generate a lot of material and ideas through articles, and then from that you see or perceive that there might be a body of work there that can be made into a book. It doesn't always happen.
Well, this kind of segues into, because I want to talk mostly today about writing about Japan, and as a book reviewer, you have the opportunity to read a lot of diverse books, some by experts, some by enthusiasts, some by dilettantes, some by people who don't know what they're talking about, I suppose. I wonder over the years, it's not like you've been doing this forever, but you've been doing this long enough maybe to detect a trend somewhat in the kinds of writing about Japan or how people approach the subject. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think publishing tends to follow the trends. I mean, in the 19th century, you had this great, or late 19th century, great flourishing of interest in Japan as a travel destination, but also as an art collector's destination. That produced some sort of Meiji era, let's say late 19th century, early 20th century writing, obviously unbeaten tracks in Japan. Yeah. A classic early travel piece that was written, I think, in the 1870s or whatever. And you had a series of travel writers covering Japan after that. For example, Isabella Bird, Unbeaten Tracks in Japan. Then in the 1920s, 30s, you had Peter Quennell, A Superficial Journey. In the 40s and 50s, Ethel Manning, the Flowery Sword. And then later you had the Alan Booth books, and then some books that you published yourself, Angus Waycott, for example.
Yes.
Sado, Japan's wonderful book. More recently, William Scott Wilson's Walking the Kiso Road. Uh-huh. Back to Stonebridge, John McDougall's Off the Beaten Tracks in Japan. But I think travel writing has fallen off somewhat. It's been overtaken or surpassed by bloggers and YouTubers and other people who are covering Japan, but not, of course, in the same way that books cover it. So you're getting the sort of the travel writing trend. I'm also seeing the sort of translation trend. I think after the Second World War, you had this amazing sort of golden age of Japanese writers, Jiro Osaragi and Kobo Abe, Junichiro Tanizaki and Shusaku Endo, etc. Some women writers, Sawako Ariyoshi, Fumiko Enshi. There's an endless list of world-class writers who were translated. And then people like Donald Ritchie, Edward Seidenstegger, Donald Keane, they came in just at the right time to ignite that interest and act as catalysts for that. And there was this flourishing of translation works. I think also some foreign writers have set novels in Japan. Susan Kamata, for example, Lisa Loich. I don't know if you know Marion Poshman, The Pine Islands, wonderful novel.
No, I don't know that.
Written recently, and Andre Newman's Fracture. These are all sort of major novels on Japan. So I think there has been that sort of development. And from that sort of period that I see from the late 40s to maybe the mid 70s, this golden age I referred to, then you had individual sort of non-movement aligned writers coming in like Yoko Ogawa and Yoko Towada, novelists who are working in a market trying to sort of link literature and non-fiction with popular culture. So you had manga and anime coming in, and then very accessible writers like Haruki Murakami and younger writers now like Mieko Kawakami. So there have been these sort of trend-linked, not exactly movements, but certainly waves of writing. Now I think you're getting a slightly different kind of thing, different kinds of publishing going on. I think in the sort of bubble economy years, the 70s and 80s, you had a lot of explain Japan books, which were very popular. I don't know if you remember Wolferen's The Enigma of Japanese Power.
Yes, I remember that. Carol Van Wolfern, yeah.
That's right. I think that was 1989. And more recently, of books like David Pilling's Bending Adversity. But I think there are less of those kind of explain Japan books. Books now are linked to people's interest, readers' interest, really, their passion and curiosity about Japan. So it covers everything, really.
The U.S. government, of course, had a large presence here in the occupation immediately after the war until the early 1950s, and they had a need for people who could speak the language. Many of those people who are renowned for their translations in the 1950s came out of the kind of U.S. government-sponsored translation programs. I guess I don't know how many went to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, but, equivalent places like that. And I guess had it not been for the war and for the particular way that the occupation was conducted, a lot of these authors would probably still be unknown to us. And the ones that are known, I wonder to what extent they're the ones that were kind of selected by the translators or the publishers. There are many, many more authors, of course, who kind of never made it into English. And I wonder what the course of Japanese literature as taught in the West would be had maybe there been more translators, had Japanese been not such an obscure language.
I think fairly early on in the war, the American administration could see how the war was going to end. They could sort of prefigure what things were going on. So a lot of these people, like Donald Keene, were sort of trained up to interview prisoners of war. They were on the battleships, the frigates, as they moved through the Pacific, all these islands. I guess it was a baptism of fire for some of those people because they learned, they applied their Japanese skills on these remote Pacific islands. And some of them became interested in Japanese literature, and I think that was an enormous influence. And as you say, a lot of these writers who we now regard as world-class writers, Japanese writers, would have probably languished in obscurity.
Yeah, but I mean, like you were talking about before, there was this genre, I guess, of travel books. Well, of course, there's Lafcadio Hearn. I remember going to finding sometimes these books at used book sales, and they were like published in 1925, and it was some guy's travel diary in Japan, and it kind of struck me as, I mean, the English was kind of fascinating because it was kind of old-timey. The insights were, I guess, very, very superficial, and yet, in many respects, they weren't very different from the same kinds of insights that casual travelers still make about Japan today. And you wonder, like, after all this time, with all these books written about Japan, the understanding of Japanese culture remains at a very, very superficial and casual, and one could almost say lazy level among many, many Westerners. And I suppose that's better than knowing nothing and better than caring nothing about it. But nevertheless, Japan still seems a very, very hard nut to crack, to get inside.
Yeah.
Do you think that's language, culture, exclusionary, xenophobia, that kind of thing?
Well, I don't think that necessarily inhibits writers. It may actually stimulate them in some ways. But I think you have to put in the time and legwork with Japan. There are very gifted writers who come here and spend a few months in Japan and write a book about it. But I think looking back over the post-war period, that brings me to the subject of another sort of niche genre in publishing, which is the memoir. And I think that does connect with your idea of experience and writing, that you have to have a lot of experience to write well about. Japan. So there have been a small number, not that many, but there have been a small number of very accomplished autobiographies or memoirs. I'm thinking of, well, John Nason actually wrote an interesting one on Japan some years ago. Robert Whiting, of course, you published his book Tokyo Junkie.
Right.
Very enjoyable read. We've also got Hans Brinkmann, the Dutch writer, his book The Call of Japan. Now, these are very seasoned writers. They've been here a very long time. I mean, Brinkmann, for example, who lives and continues to write in Fukuoka, he came to Japan in 1950. And I think sort of the memoirs and autobiographies overlap with another kind of genre, which is small but well supported, which is what you might call the lifestyle books, living in Japan books. I think good examples would be Rebecca Otawa's At Home in Japan, and more recently the Hannah Kirshner's Water, Wood and Wild Things, which is about life in the village of Yamanaka.
We published, Donald Ritchie's Japan journals. And of course, as far as writers about Japan, I guess Ritchie is one of the towering figures for longevity, if no other reason. I mean, because he was in Japan for, I don't know, about 60 years maybe. And you got to have his job because he was a reviewer for the Japan Times also. Very prolific. We were his one of a number of different publishers who work with him, and I work with him in his later years. And yeah, I mean, he could still just kind of churn this stuff out. He had so many personal connections. He seemed to know everybody, and so he was like always able to, pull out an anecdote and put something together and, combine things. It was a very, very interesting skill that he had.
He started off writing for the Stars and Stripes.
That's right, yeah.
Apparently he got the job because he was the only person who could type. and the rest is history, as they say.
Yeah.
He was a good example of a specialist with general interests. I mean, his special interest was film, but he, as you said, he was protean in his writing. He could write about anything.
and maybe because it was film, which is a kind of worldwide art, Ritchie had an enormous influence on other writers, and I think on the whole discussion about Japanese art. Really, unless you're, I guess, very fluent in the language and have spent a lot of time and can see the subtleties of human interaction, etc. It's a danger to take things at face value, because face value in Japan is tatemae. It's what they want you to see, what you should be seeing, but the real stuff is all happening on the inside.
Well, there is a tendency. I think it's the same with travelers, people who make YouTube videos. You want to see the best in Japan. You want to leave the country with a nice warm glow.
Right.
And that's fine. But of course, it can lead to distorted views or dated views of Japan, the sort of sweet mystery of the Orient. There are writers like Robert Whiting and people like that who, investigative journalists and other writers who dig a little bit deeper. And I think Donald Ritchie was more of a sort of aesthete, wasn't he? Like a Bunjin, a kind of literary figure himself, and more interested in the aesthetics and the classical aspects of Japan. But he did introduce popular culture. I mean, a lot of his book touch on quite sort of trendy subjects, really. I think he was very up to date.
Well, and he had a very vulgar side to him too, and I mean, he
had a very vulgar.
Yeah, he loved getting down in the dirt.
I knew him a little bit. He did pass on a book, The Persian Diaries, which was about his encounters with Iranians in Ueno Park. I won't go into any more details on that.
I have heard of this book. You have a copy of it?
I may have a copy somewhere. Yeah. It's sealed somewhere on my computer.
He used to mention that to me, that he had, because we were doing the Japan journals, and that it kind of got into some moderately salacious stuff, but nothing shocking or anything. But he said, I have this other manuscript, and I'd like to see it published after I'm dead.
Yeah, well, I'm one of the few people who've actually read it.
What do you think?
Well, well, they say that D.H. Lawrence opened the door, Henry Miller kicked it in, and I'm not sure what Donald Ritchie did in this book. It was transgressional.
Well,
yes, I think that there's most writers favour a softer approach to Japan.
Sure.
I think that's, in the last 10 or so years, you've had, a flowering of, I suppose you call self-help books, mental care, transcendence, books on things like ikigai, finding your purpose in life, Shinrin Yoku, forest bathing.
It's a great term, yeah.
Yeah, through nature. But I can't help thinking myself that these are sort of repackaging, really, of ideas and practices that have been around for hundreds or thousands of years, really. They've just been given a name and explored. You've also got, of course, lots of books on Zen, because for the more challenged reader. And I think there's some really recent publications that are quite profound. I think the book that you brought out, Illusory Dwellings, Aesthetic Meditations in Kyoto by Alan S. Weiss. I think that's a fine example of it's a highly original book, a great sort of intellectual quality. I think it bears comparison with the book I've just finished reading by the English writer Olivia Lang. It's called The Garden Against Time in Search of a Common Paradise. So there is a place for serious books that could even be called profound. As I say, the publishing world and media's a buzz really with these life-enhancing concepts. And again, there is a bit of a rose-tinted view. I mean, Shinrin Yoku, forest bathing, is a wonderful idea. If anybody who's visited a Japanese forest in the spring or summer knows that it's not like an English forest where you can lie down among the bluebells and dream. Japanese forests are full of mosquitoes, poisonous snakes, really unlucky, a bear or a wild boar.
Is that a term that you ever heard before there was an English book by that title?
No, I never heard this.
I never heard it either. And I mean, I used to go out with hikes, Japanese in the countryside. They never refer to that. I mean, it's a great idea, but like you say, it's sort of a repackaging of something. Well, I mean, we did a book a number of years ago called Green Tea Living, which is sort of in that category. It's really just about stuff you do with green tea and the different things you can use the tea for, the tea leaves, the tea drinking, etc. Nothing more than that, but it was like packaged as a whole, as if it was like a lifestyle in and unto itself. As far as I know, there are no people who teach the art of green tea living, tea ceremony, but it wasn't that at all.
Well, there are some interesting niches. I mean, I think recently in the Japanese publishing world, you've seen a boom in cat-related literature, fiction, non-fiction, and a lot of those books are being translated into English and other languages. You've got The Guest Cat, for example. It's a novel by Takashi Hiraide. You've got Hiro Arikawa's The Travelling Cat Chronicles. And you also got some Western writers, Nick Bradley's novel, The Cat and the City, and then the non-fiction book, The Cat with Three Passports, C.J. Fentiman. So I'm wondering if it's getting to saturation point, but there's certainly a lot of cat-related books.
We had our own cat novel come out, but it came out about 7 or 8 years ago, called Kanai the Otama, and fortuitously it has an actual cat on the cover.
Well, the more you delve into the subject, the more you find. Junichiro Tanizaki wrote a novel about a cat.
Yes, that's right. And of course, there's I Am a Cat, Soseki's. Do you have any pet peeves when it comes to people writing about Japan? Stuff is like, oh, not that again, or I wish they wouldn't do X, Y, or Z. Anything bug you?
Not really. I think there's, sometimes there's an oversupply of books on certain subjects, particularly things like cooking recipe books and so on. But I don't see that as a defect. I mean, it enlarges the market. Yeah, I guess people who, you mentioned defective writers, people who sort of set themselves up as authorities on Japan just after lightning visits to the country.
Right.
Those kind of writers sometimes have commercial success, but a little bit irritating when you think about more sober, more gifted, and
They used to criticize James Clavell for not knowing enough about Japan, and didn't seem to hurt his book sales though.
well, that's interesting. Talking about books that made into films. I mean, that's another interesting area. There aren't that many, but I think obviously Shogun, the remake, is I haven't seen it, but it's proving very popular. I don't know if you remember, but it can take a long time for this process to happen. I don't know if you remember a book called The Earthquake Bird.
No.
Published in 2001 by Susanna Jones, an English writer. And Netflix picked it up and made it into a film in 2019. So you had to wait almost 20 years for that to happen. You also had Tokyo Vice, Jake Adelstein's book that I think it came out in 2009, but then HBO Max made it into a TV series in 2020.
Yeah, and that was very successful too. Well, we're running low on time, but I wanted to give you a chance to talk just a little bit about the book you have coming out. And you've written other books on gardens. How is this one different from those, and how long did it take you to write it, etc.?
Well, it was different in the sense that I sent a proposal to Thames and Hudson for a garden book. It was a different garden book, and they got back to me and they said they liked the writing and the images, but they were not thinking of doing a book on that. Would you be interested in doing something on modern Japanese gardens? And it was a long process. The first year was really back and forth Zoom meetings, discussing possible content, format, length, and so on. The next 2 years were the writing and the photography, visiting all these different places. And then the last year, which includes now, is really the production, I guess, stage. So all in all, a 4-year process. Yeah.
My gosh. And did you do all the photography?
Yeah, I did all the photography.
And were most of these gardens what you would call the Tsuboniwa type of garden, where it's like in an enclosed space?
Well, it's got a big range of gardens. There are larger gardens, that sort of smaller versions of straw gardens. There are Tsuboniwa, Nakaniwa, courtyard gardens. There are experimental gardens. There are gardens which are part of hotel landscapes. There are gardens that are part of businesses as well, research centres. Quite a lot of different styles of garden. The time frame we call modern gardens will be 1900 to the present.
So not all modernist, you might say. There are still some that were done in a very classical tradition.
Well, the sort of early gardens that I included from around 1900 to the 1930s, for somebody who knows a bit about garden design, can see the innovations in the gardens. But for a lot of people, they look like traditional gardens. The Ogawa Jihei, for example, his gardens in Kyoto and Osaka, they look fairly traditional to the unschooled eye, but actually they were quite innovative. His use of water, for example, the way that he actually manipulated water, his use of lawns and rocks is very different to previous Edo era principles of gardening. So I start off with those modest innovations and then go into the post-war period.
We did a book a number of years ago on the gardens of Shigemori, and those are fantastic. And I had remembered his gardens because I saw one of them at one of the sub-temples at Daitokuji, I think, and it was one where the stones were like really vertical and had all this energy. It was very, very dramatic and so different in tone. I mean, it's the same materials, but the the positioning and the energy, and it was really, really striking. I thought it was really quite wonderful.
Yeah, well, he certainly had a major presence in this book because he was an iconoclast. He was quite radical. I think he divided the gardening community into people who thought he was very exciting, and other people who disapproved of his.
I'm sure.
Because he used concrete and coloured sand and tile and unorthodox materials.
We've done a couple books with Mark Keane, who I think you're familiar with his work as well. I mean, interestingly, he gets commissions from, I guess, Japanese patrons. I don't know how unusual it is to, for a non-Japanese garden designer to be hired to do a quote-unquote Japanese garden, but he seems to be, pretty well established there.
I think he's one of the only people who's sort of working in the Japanese tradition, but innovating within that tradition. There are quite a lot of other designers who've come in from Europe and America and gardens, but they're not really Japanese gardens. They're gardens in Japan.
I guess that's a big topic of like what makes a Japanese garden, and it's not the fact that there's a lantern and a Buddha. That's got like nothing to do with it. But then maybe that's a subject for another day. Anyway, I really look forward to seeing that book. It is one of my favorite subject areas, and I'm just an admirer, so I don't know anything. So it's really a pleasure for me to talk to someone who's a lot more knowledgeable about it. So thank you very much for coming.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you, yeah.
To find out more about Stonebridge Press and our books and authors, go to www.stonebridge.com. You can find our Substack, The Stone Bridge, at stonebridgepress.substack.com, and you can visit and message us on Twitter at StonebridgePub or on Facebook at Stonebridge Press. To reach us by regular email, write to us at sbp@stonebridge.com.